Aragorn harnessing the power of the dead army is one of the most pivotal moments in the War of the Ring. As we watch Minas Tirith on the precipice of falling during the Siege of Gondor and the South being invaded by mercenaries, we get the feeling that all hope is lost. But thankfully, Aragorn, taking up his position as the rightful heir to the throne of Gondor, summons to him an army more powerful than any other, and he uses them to turn the tides of the war. But how does this movie version of the Paths of the Dead stack up against Tolkien's original writings? Well, between Elrond's visit, the exclusion of critical characters to the plot, and the revision of how the Dead Army is used, the film adaptation of Tolkien's epic saga is drastically different from the book. So in today's video, I'm going to reveal exactly what happened during the Muster of Rohan and Aragorn's trip on the Paths of the Dead. My name is Gibby, and welcome back to episode 39 of Movies vs. Manuscripts, Lord of the Rings edition. This is the show where I compare Peter Jackson's epic trilogy to the books that inspired them and find all the differences along the way. Before we go any further, however, I wanted to give a shout out to this commenter from a previous episode. Each week, I highlight one of the top comments from a past video, so be sure to share your thoughts down below when you're done watching. Also, I normally mention this at the end of the video, but we just hit 95,000 subscribers, which means we're so close to 100K. If you come back week to week and enjoy these videos but have yet to subscribe, I would greatly appreciate you hitting that button and helping us out on our road to reach that insane milestone. Per usual, I'll cover all the changes across the four major categories of characters, timeline, location, and plot. But first, let's recap what happened during these scenes in the movie. Picking up with where we left off last week, the movie cuts to Theoden, Aragorn, and everyone else riding through a valley and heading to Dun Harrow. We then see Aragorn and Theoden standing on the cliffside talking to one another about how they must be ready to leave for Gondor by dawn. Then we switch to Legolas and Gimli's perspective as they talk with Éomer about the mountain and about how the men and horses are afraid of it. Then we see Aragorn looking into the mountain pass and seeing what looks like a ghost standing there staring at him. The movie then cuts to nighttime as Éowyn is finishing up Merry's wardrobe for battle, and Éomer reprimands her about encouraging his desire to go to war. After this, the movie shows us Aragorn asleep in his tent as he is having a bad dream about Arwen, and then he suddenly wakes up as he's summoned to Theoden's tent. Aragorn goes into Theoden's tent and is greeted by Elrond, who delivers him news of enemies moving in the south, and then he tells Aragorn to use the men of the mountain. Aragorn says that they will only listen to the king, and Elrond presents him with Andúril, telling Aragorn to become who he was born to be. The movie then cuts to later that night as Aragorn is packing up his things and preparing to take the dim old road. But he is stopped by Éowyn, who asks why he is leaving. They chat for a bit, and Aragorn has to break it to her that he isn't in love with her, and then she runs off. Then he gets stopped again before he can continue as Legolas and Gimli tell him that they're going with him. Then the three of them head into the mountain pass, and the men of Rohan panic as three of their best fighters have now left them. The movie then cuts to the next morning, and we see Theoden speaking with Éowyn as he tells her to lead the people in his absence. They share a nice moment, and then we cut back to our trio as they're riding through the ravines and get to the door under the mountain. The horses run off as they're scared, and Aragorn charges into the mountain with Gimli and Legolas right behind him. Then we cut back to the Muster of Rohan as we see everyone preparing to leave Harrowdale and head to Minas Tirith. Theoden tells Merry that he cannot come, but after the king leaves, Merry is picked up by a rider who he finds out is Éowyn in disguise. And that is the last we'll see of them for this week. But that doesn't finish up our scenes this week, as we still need to go back to Aragorn as he traverses the Paths of the Dead, and he comes face to face with the King of the Dead. He declares who he is and calls upon them to fulfill their oath, but they all disappear. Suddenly, an avalanche of skulls and bones comes crashing down upon them, and Gimli, Legolas, and Aragorn barely make it out alive. After exiting the mountain, they see corsair ships sailing down a river with cities burning on the shoreline. But just as Aragorn begins to lose hope, the King of the Dead comes behind him and tells him that they will fight. Lastly, we see Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli on the shoreline looking at some ships as they pass by, and then after some movie-esque banter, the army of the dead swarms the enemy and defeats them. And that is where scenes end for this week. So now that your memory is refreshed on what happens during these scenes, let's head into our analysis and check out the first three categories of characters, timeline, and location. Starting with characters, we once again are missing some crucial people for the plot. First, we don't get to see the Grey Company, which includes Halbarad. These 31 Dunedain Rangers are super impactful to the story and stick with Aragorn until the end. Then, along with them, we miss out on Elrond's sons, Elrohir and Elladan. They deliver a message to Aragorn and are also close companions with him. And finally, we miss Hirgon, who really isn't an important character by himself, but the task he performs is an integral one which the movie completely removed. So keep an eye out for him in the plot changes. Next, our timeline changes are pretty simple. First, Aragorn had already taken the dim old road by the time Theoden showed up at Dunharrow. And second, we'll cover this more in the plot changes, but the movie skips over multiple days of travel that Aragorn and company have after they exit the mountain. And finally, before we jump into the plot changes, we have several missing locations. First, we don't ever see Helm's Deep again, even though Theoden, Aragorn, and all their people head there after leaving Isengard. And several key plot points happen at this location. I'll mention it later on, but I cover this more in episode 35. So if you haven't, be sure to check that out after this video. The second location change, in a similar vein as the multiple days travel that got removed, is that the movie shows the Corsairs gliding along the river right after Aragorn exits the mountain. However, the actual place where the mercenaries were was a multiple-day journey from the mountain, so the map is totally shifted around for the film. And finally, our last location change is the Stone of Eric, which the movie completely removed. This is a symbolic relic filled with lore that the movie didn't want to take the time to explain, but I'll touch on it near the end of our changes for this week, so stay tuned for that. Before we get into the plot changes, I just want to remind you that I can't cover every single word spoken and line changed in the movie, because that would make this video longer than the trilogy itself. So instead, I highly encourage you check out the audiobooks on Audible if you're looking to relive Middle-earth or experience it for the first time. You can claim your free trial using my link in the description, which will support the channel and get you one free audiobook. Anyway, with that being said, let's get into the plot changes. The first change we have this week is a simple one that relates to our timeline change we just mentioned, and that is that Aragorn and Theoden would not have been together during this time. In this scene, we see them riding through Harrowdale and then continuing on up to Dunharrow, and Aragorn departs later that night. However, in the book, Theoden left Aragorn at Helm's Deep and took the Rohirrim to Dunharrow, while Aragorn and the Grey Company took a swifter road to get to the Paths of the Dead as soon as possible. Theoden never even sees Aragorn because by the time he and the Rohirrim arrive, Aragorn has already gone into the mountain. So this scene of them talking and then everything after it of them together never would have happened. Next, we see the horses acting up as they're scared in the shadow of the mountain, and Gimli asks what that road is that cuts in between the rocks. Legolas tells him it is the road to the Dimult, the door under the mountain, and Éomer adds on that no one who enters there ever returns. This brief moment in the movie is Jackson's way of quickly giving us some context, which will be built upon later on. But of course, in a book format, Tolkien took a different approach, and we never actually have a moment of Gimli and Legolas talking with Éomer about this. After all, they're with Aragorn and Éomer is with Theoden, which means they never would have even seen each other at Dunharrow. The person who does have this conversation, however, is Merry. You see, Merry went with Theoden, and upon arriving at Dunharrow, they ate together, and Merry asked the question that had been nagging at him. What exactly was the Paths of the Dead? To give some context, at this point in the book, Aragorn had already arrived at Dunharrow and then taken his company into the mountain, like we've discussed. So when Theoden and Merry arrived, Éowyn reported that Aragorn had taken the Paths of the Dead. Everyone's reaction to this made Merry worry, and Éomer even said that Aragorn was now lost. So as they ate, Merry asked his question, and Theoden told him what he knew of that road. The people of Rohan didn't know the full context of what or who was behind the door, but they knew that everyone who had ever ventured in there had never returned. The last person to do this was Baldur, son of Brago, and we learn an interesting tale from this. Theoden, attempting to comfort Éowyn in her grief for the loss of Aragorn, tells her that not all hope is lost, and that when Baldur and his father Brago went to the door many years ago, they saw an old man sitting at the front, who seemed to be made of stone. Thinking that he was stone, they tried to walk past him, but the withered old man began talking and said, "The way is shut. It was made by those who are dead, and the dead keep it until the time comes. The way is shut." Theoden then goes on to tell Éowyn and the others that perhaps that time has come, and Aragorn may pass through the mountain unharmed. And speaking of Aragorn in the mountain, we have a small change regarding this scene in which Aragorn sees the Ghost King. Simply put, he never sees any ghosties before entering the mountain. Next, in the movie, we see Éowyn fitting Merry with some armor and then talking to Éomer after sending Merry to get his sword sharpened. This is only somewhat accurate. In the book, there is actually a moment in which Éowyn helps Merry get a set of armor that fits him, but there's no dialogue between Éomer and Éowyn about war and how it is for men and all of that. Maybe there's a random line like this earlier in the book that I missed, so let me know in the comments if you found that. But as far as I'm aware, this interaction is just a way for Jackson to build up to the later payoff of Éowyn defeating the Witch King. Now, before I go into a string of changes with Aragorn and the Paths of the Dead, I wanted to mention a key detail that is omitted from the film, and that is the red arrow. I've mentioned it in previous episodes, but if you're just now tuning into the series, the Red Arrow was Gondor's way of calling for aid in the most dire of situations. It sort of was like the last resort of saying, hey Rohan, if you don't get here now, we're all gonna die. Soon after Theoden had finished telling Merry and Éowyn the tale of Brago and Baldur, a messenger arrived for the king. The messenger, named Hirgon, was from Minas Tirith and presented Theoden with the Red Arrow. Theoden then realized the seriousness of the situation and decided that they would need to set out as soon as possible. I won't get into all the dialogue between Theoden and the messenger, but their conversation really helps to show Theoden's true character in the books. As I've mentioned many times before, the movie sort of makes Theoden have this internal struggle, and earlier on we're unsure if he will support Gondor in their need. But during this conversation in the book, Theoden says that even if Rohan felt no peril, they would ride to Minas Tirith's aid. And after Hirgon says that they might all be dead by the time the Rohirrim arrive, Theoden says that at least they can interrupt the orcs' feast and slay as many as possible. Now, by the time Theoden gets to Dunharrow in the movie, he is much more on track with his book counterpart, and we even have a moment of him later on telling his men that they will meet the enemy in battle nonetheless. So I'm happy we eventually get to see this side of Theoden in the film, but it's important to remember that Theoden in the book has been willing to go to battle since the very beginning. And on that note, we can now get into a few changes with Aragorn and his decision to head into the mountain. The movie completely rewrote this entire narrative and changed the plot so drastically that it's kind of hard to cover the changes in a decent order. But I'm going to try to follow the movie scenes and cover the changes one by one as best I can. So first up, Elrond never shows up at Dunharrow. This moment, however, is obviously inspired by the chapter The Passing of the Grey Company in the book. This is the second chapter in The Return of the King, and I have covered the first half of it in a previous video. So for a more detailed breakdown, you can check out episode 35 of this series. Essentially, the first half of the chapter details Theoden, Aragorn, and their company's journey from Isengard to Helm's Deep. During this journey, they run into the Grey Company, which is a group of Dunedain rangers from the north. The leader of the group is Halbarad, and along with him there are two elves who are Elrond's sons, Elrohir and Elladan. Essentially, Elrond's visit with Aragorn here in the movie is a combination of Elrohir, Elladan, and Halbarad's interaction with Aragorn in the book. In fact, Elrohir even gives a message to Aragorn from his father, which says, "The days are short, if thou art in haste, remember the paths of the dead." This is very similar to what Elrond tells Aragorn in the movie. Then, as for a physical object, Halbarad is carrying the kingly standard that Arwen had made Aragorn. This is comparable to Elrond bringing Aragorn Anduril, which is representative of his kingship in the movie. But in the book, the standard is the representation of his kingship, and it is revealed later on, which I'll cover in a bit. As you might have guessed, this brings on another change that I have to mention, and that is the fact that Aragorn in the book has had Anduril ever since they left Rivendell in the Fellowship of the Ring. The movie saves this big reveal for this moment, and I kind of get it. First of all, it is better in a film to continue building out a character the viewer is already familiar with, like Elrond, instead of introducing three brand new people. In the same way, dividing the viewer's attention between the sword and the kingly standard might have been a bit confusing or less impactful, so it makes sense that they decided to just use Anduril as the sole sign of Aragorn's kingship in the film. But anyway, the next change is that Elrond informing Aragorn about the enemies approaching from the south never happens in the book. Obviously, Elrond never meets with Aragorn in the book as we discussed, but more than that, we actually read about how Aragorn really finds out this information. Again, I talked about this in episode 35, but we read that Aragorn used the Palantir in Helm's Deep, not only revealing himself to Sauron, but also bending the Seeing Stone to his will and seeing a massive army approaching from the south. He then uses this information, combined with Elrohir's message about remembering the paths of the dead, to come to the decision that in order to reach the south in time, they'd have to cut through the mountains. If they tried to travel around the mountain, they would be too late and all hope would be lost. So the reasoning for taking the paths of the dead is almost twofold. First, Aragorn knows the history of the dead and that they need to fulfill their oath. And second, taking that path is literally the only way to make it to the south in time. And I believe with that, we can move on from Elrond's involvement and head into the next scene, which shows us Aragorn packing up and Éowyn confronting him. This is a very interesting conversation and change, because it does happen in the book, but the movie doesn't show it in its entirety. Typically, I don't blame the movie for cutting down dialogue, and as you know, I try not to go line by line. But the intriguing part about this specific conversation is that Jackson and the other writers for the movie pulled this interaction to pieces and threw it all around the movie timeline. Technically, in the book, this involves two conversations. One conversation the night that Aragorn arrives, and a second conversation the morning after when he departs. We only get a small taste of it during this current scene, But remember Éowyn and Aragorn's conversation in Helm's Deep? The one where she practically tells him she loves him? Well, that is pulled from this conversation in the book. Also, remember the moment in Edoras when Éowyn hands Aragorn a cup to drink from? That happens the morning Aragorn departs from Dunharrow. Really, I can't blame them for doing this in the movie, and I actually think it's pretty smart. The conversation in the book is too long to include as one scene for the film, but the dialogue is so good that they still wanted to use it, so they spread it out throughout 2 movies and 3 scenes. Smart play in my opinion. Next, before Aragorn heads into the mountain, we see him walking away from Éowyn and getting stopped by Gimli and Legolas. He tries to turn them away, but they refuse to let him go alone. This part is a little ridiculous and shows the major difference between book and movie Aragorn. In the book, Aragorn tells everyone that they by no means are forced to come with him, but he would gladly have them come if they want to. So obviously, this is completely opposite to the movie. On top of this, we have another small change regarding who goes with Aragorn, as in the book, the entire Grey Company and Elrond's sons accompany him. But before we go into the mountain itself, the movie cuts to the next morning as Éowyn and Theoden speak to one another. I think this is a good scene in the movie, but technically, Theoden doesn't hand over the rule to Éowyn at this time. I believe this is inspired from earlier in the book when Theoden, Éomer, and the Rohirrim set out to fight Saruman's forces. Before they leave, Hama suggests that Éowyn be put in charge since all the people love her, and so Theoden puts her in charge. However, this is only because Éomer is absent and Wormtongue was proven a traitor. Obviously, since the movie had Éowyn and all the people go to Helm's Deep in the movie, they didn't show this moment, so they just reused it for this part of the plot instead. Now technically, the next thing we see in the movie is our trio riding through the mountain pass to get to the door. But in order to avoid jumping around and giving you whiplash, I'm going to address the final changes regarding the Muster of Rohan now, and then we'll end the video with the Paths of the Dead. So first up, we see a brief scene in the movie of the Rohirrim preparing to leave, and Merry is told that he cannot come with them. Technically, this is true, but it doesn't happen until later as the movie removed the first part of the Rohirrim's journey. They actually needed to go to Edoras first, where they would restock their supplies and then continue to Minas Tirith. So Theoden tells Merry at Dunharrow that he won't be going with them all the way to Gondor, but that he can ride with him for now until they get to Edoras. It is after this brief interaction that Éowyn comes up and takes Merry away to give him armor, as she tells him that she believes he will need it in the end. Then the Rohirrim and Merry all set out for Edoras, and after resting and replenishing supplies, the riders prepared to set out again, with Merry begging the king once more to let him come. But after the king confirmed that he would not let Merry ride with them, Merry found himself being approached by a young rider. And this triggers our second change with this scene in the movie, which is that Merry doesn't know it's Éowyn. In the movie, Merry gets picked up by a rider and then he quickly learns who it is, but in the book, he simply sees a young rider approach him and offer to take him along. Merry thanks him but says he does not know his name, and the rider says, "Do you not? Then call me Durnhelm," and that is the end of the chapter. So now that we've wrapped up Merry, Theoden, and Éowyn's involvement, we can solely focus on Aragorn and the Paths of the Dead for the rest of our changes. In total, we have 7 remaining alterations that the movie made to this crucial moment in the story. So let's rewind a bit and go back to where we last left Aragorn and company. In the movie, we see them slowly riding on horseback through the ravines in the mountain, and they eventually come to the door. Once they arrive, we see the horses run away. Well, that's change number 1, because they actually take the horses in with them. Halbarad tries to tell Aragorn that no horse will enter, but Aragorn states that many leagues lay beyond them if they make it through the pass, so the horses must come too. The next change is more of an omission, as we read that after an unknown amount of time walking through the mountain, they eventually saw something glittering in the cave. Aragorn approached it and saw that it was a dead body whose bony fingers could be seen clawing at a door that was sealed shut. This skeleton belonged to none other than Baldur, son of Brago, the one Theoden had mentioned earlier, but Aragorn did not touch the body and quickly got up, shouting into the darkness at the ghosts who were following them that this is not his errand and that the dead can keep their secrets. Instead, he shouts at them that he only asks for speed, and then he says that he summons the dead to the Stone of Eric. And this is where we have our next couple changes. As in the movie, we watch Aragorn confront the King of the Dead and then nearly die while trying to leave. The main change is that, beyond what I just mentioned, they don't speak to the dead in the mountain. But this also means that they don't almost die in a skull avalanche. Instead, they continue to walk through the mountain for most of the day, only emerging from the ravine about 2 hours before sunset. So if they don't confront the dead inside the mountain, when do they? Well, that's where we come to one of the largest revisions regarding the Paths of the Dead. You see, Tolkien writes that after exiting the mountain, Aragorn instructs them to make haste as they must reach the Stone of Eric before sunset. Now, if you don't know, the Stone of Eric was a large round black stone that had been brought out of Numenor and set on the Hill of Eric by Isildur. This stone represented Isildur's lordship and also acted as a place of meeting. Plus, it was a sign of the covenant that the men of the mountain made with Gondor, as it was the place where they swore allegiance to Isildur. So, when the men of the mountain did not hold to their oath, Isildur cursed them and said that one day they would be summoned to the stone again to fulfill their oath. That being said, I kind of understand why this was removed from the film. First off, building up the mountain for them to just pass through unharmed would seem a bit anticlimactic for the film. Plus, after they exit, they had to travel a couple hours to the Stone of Eric, so that would add time onto the film as well. Then on top of all of that, you have to explain the complex lore and symbolism behind some rock, so the viewer of the movie understands why it was necessary to summon the dead there and not anywhere else. All in all, it makes sense why Jackson and co. just decided to have all of this take place in the mountain. But no matter how necessary the change might have been, it's a change nonetheless. In the book, Aragorn and everyone else ride swiftly to the Stone of Eric, with the dead following behind them from the mountain. Then at the stone, Aragorn unfurls his kingly standard, which Halbarad had kept rolled up this whole time, and he declared himself as Isildur's heir and called the dead to fulfill their oath. And that brings us to our final two changes. First, we see in the movie that as soon as they exit the mountain, they can see the cities below burning and the corsairs of Umbar sailing by. This is totally wrong. As I mentioned in the location changes, Pelargir was a 5 days journey from the Stone of Eric, so we learn in a later part of the book, from a retelling of the story by Legolas and Gimli, that they journeyed with the dead army to Pelargir and then wiped out not only the mercenaries, but the Haradrim as well. And on those ships and throughout the land, they found many slaves that the enemy had taken, and they freed those people as well. Then, after they finished up their work, Aragorn climbed onto one of the largest ships and announced to the dead that they had fulfilled their oath, and they could go be at peace. And that is our final change, and maybe the most impactful of them all. As you know in the movie, Jackson uses the dead again in the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, but in the book, Aragorn holds to his promise and frees the dead after they help at Pelargir. Now that doesn't mean that Aragorn didn't have any help later on when he went to Minas Tirith. After all, he had the Grey Company and Elrond's sons, but they also had a decent amount of men who joined the fight after being freed at Pelargir. But that's getting a little ahead of ourselves. For now, that wraps up all of our changes for this week's scenes. So now that you've heard it all, what do you think? Do you prefer the book version, or do you think that this was properly adapted to fit the film format? Let me know in the comments below. As always, be sure to check out the series playlist in the description to catch up on any episodes you might have missed so far. Other than that, have a great week, and I'll see you in the next episode.